They said maybe if we unplug it for a while, she'll go peacefully, like Grandma Jean. And I remember the way Renee smiled at me when she said it, as if I were already half gone, as if my ears had lost their purpose, as if I were nothing but a body, taking up space and stealing electricity from the wall. I was awake, I was watching, and the hiss of my oxygen tank was still my only rhythm of survival. But in her voice, I heard the decision that had already been made. People imagine betrayal as something loud, a slammed door, a shouted insult. But the truth is quieter and sharper. And when it comes, it arrives with a false smile and a hand hovering just above the plug of your machine. I am 83 years old, and I live now in a small rented room above a garage in Pensacola, Florida, surrounded by secondhand furniture and the faint scent of motor oil that seeps up through the floorboards. It is not glamorous. It is not the home I once dreamed of retiring into. But it is mine. And the air that fills my lungs here is attached to a machine I control, a cord that no one else dares to touch. And that fact alone feels like a kind of miracle. When I say I am 83, people often look at me with that tilted head pity, as though age itself were a disease. But age was never my enemy. My enemy wore pearl earrings and perfume that smelled faintly of gardenias. My son's second wife, Renee, who always said she wanted to take care of me, who insisted it was her Christian duty to bring me into their home after my fall, who praised herself in front of neighbors for opening her doors to the elderly. At first, I believed her because I wanted to, because my bones ached and my lungs rattled, and my son, Mark, looked at me with helplessness in his eyes. But soon enough, I learned that kindness can be another form of control, and that some smiles are nothing but cages. The fall that brought me into their home was nothing extraordinary, just a stumble on the back porch steps when I was trying to water the last stubborn geraniums I had kept alive through the summer heat. But it was enough to fracture my hip and force me into a hospital bed for 3 long weeks, and by the time I was discharged, I knew I could not return alone to the little apartment where I had been living. Mark said it would be temporary, just until I healed, and I nodded, grateful, naive, unaware that in his house, healing was never the intention. The first days were calm enough. My bed was placed in the guest room. My oxygen machine rolled into a corner with neat precision, and Renee fussed over me with that efficient air of a woman who likes her systems more than the people inside them. She brought me soup served in white porcelain bowls, adjusted the pillows behind my back with quick, brisk hands, and told me not to worry about anything. I wanted to believe her, so I let myself relax, even smiled when she patted my hand with rehearsed warmth. But then I began to notice the silences, the way conversations would pause when I entered the kitchen, the way Mark would clear his throat and change the subject if I asked about bills or the house. Renee spoke to me in the same sing-song voice she used with their dog, as if words were commands disguised as affection. "Time for your rest now. Don't fuss with your machine. Let me handle it. You've done enough." Each phrase sounded like kindness, but each one erased me a little more. I had lived long enough to understand the shape of real care. I had buried my husband after 39 years of marriage, held his hand through chemo, whispered stories in his ear when his hearing was nearly gone. I had raised a son who cried into my skirt when he was 8, and the neighbor boy called him weak, and I had pressed my lips to his forehead and told him that strength was not cruelty, that the real proof of manhood was gentleness. I had stood in kitchens at midnight baking birthday cakes with borrowed sugar. I had worked double shifts in a laundromat so Mark could go to college, and I had never once unplugged someone else's survival. And yet here I was, lying in their guest room, my body bruised, my lungs fighting, and hearing my own daughter-in-law suggest that the simplest solution was silence, that the neatest way to end an inconvenience was to stop the hissing machine that tethered me to this life. What makes betrayal unbearable is not its novelty, but its familiarity. You never expect a stranger to save you, and so when they do not, there is no grief. But when the faces you fed, the people you built, the family you sacrificed for, stand at your bedside and calculate the cost of your next breath, the wound runs deeper than the flesh. It cuts into memory. It carves away trust. It tells you that all the decades of work and love and sacrifice have been reduced to a line item on someone else's budget. I remember lying in that room, the curtains drawn too tightly, the air faint with the scent of bleach, and realizing that I was being erased not with malice, but with indifference, and that indifference was sharper than any cruelty could have been. I do not tell you this for pity. I do not need pity. I have lived too long, seen too much to beg for it. I tell you this because the truth has weight, and if I do not speak it, it will settle into silence and crush me. I want you to know how it feels to hear your own daughter-in-law say you would be better off without air. I want you to know how it feels to look at your son and wonder if he will speak, if he will defend you, if the boy who once clung to your waist will say, "No, she is my mother." And I want you to know what it feels like when he does not. People think death comes in hospitals with white sheets and monitors that beep. They think it comes with solemn doctors and whispered prayers. But sometimes death arrives in a suburban living room, in a well-decorated house with granite counters, in the form of a woman smiling at you while her hand hovers near your oxygen plug. Sometimes death wears perfume. Sometimes death hums softly while folding laundry. And sometimes death is not a thing you fear, but a thing you fight. Because not breathing is not as terrifying as being silenced before you are ready. So here I am, alive, speaking, not because they wanted me to, but because I still had a choice left. My story does not begin with my childhood or my marriage or the life I once lived. My story begins in that moment when Renee smiled and whispered her plan, when I realized that survival was not about oxygen, but about reclaiming my voice. I begin here because here is where I almost ended, and because endings, when you resist them, can be turned into beginnings. I am 83 years old, and I live above a garage now, in a room that smells of oil and freedom, and the air that fills my lungs is my own. And that, at this age, is more than enough. The night it became undeniable, the night the mask finally slipped, was not marked by shouting or slammed doors or any visible explosion, but by the small sound of silence that filled the room when my oxygen machine went still. It was a Friday evening, I remember, because I had heard the distant echoes of the neighbors gathering in their backyard, the muffled laughter, the clink of glasses, the kind of life I once knew and had hosted myself when my body was younger and my lungs stronger. Mark had gone upstairs after dinner to help his stepson with homework, or so he claimed, though I suspected he simply wanted distance. And Renee lingered in the kitchen, humming tunelessly while she rinsed dishes and stacked them with military precision in the dishwasher. I was half asleep in the guest bed, the steady hiss of oxygen a lullaby I relied upon, when suddenly the rhythm broke. The hose that had been my lifeline for years went silent. The faint pressure in my nostrils disappeared, and the room fell into a suffocating quiet so thick it startled me awake. At first, I thought it was a mechanical failure. Machines falter, wires loosen, electricity flickers. I told myself not to panic, that I could call for help, that Mark would come. But then, through the thin gap in the door, I heard Renee's voice, calm and deliberate, speaking on the phone to someone I could not place. "It's better this way. Quicker. Hospice won't take her if she's stable. You understand what I'm saying, right?" Yes, I know it sounds harsh, but everyone agrees she's suffering. It's merciful. Her words fell into me like ice water poured directly into my veins because suffering was not the truth. I was weak. Yes. I was frail. Yes. But I was still alive, still conscious, still myself. My suffering was not from disease alone, but from the way they treated me, as though my life were an inconvenience they were entitled to shorten. I did not cry out right away. Instinct told me to stay silent, to feign the helplessness they already imagined, because in silence I could listen, and in listening I could learn the extent of the betrayal. Renee lowered her voice then, but not enough to hide the words. "Hospice will step in as soon as there's a decline. Once she slips, it'll all be handled. The sooner the better, before Mark has to deal with more expenses." Expenses. That was the word that cut deepest. Not mother, not woman, not grandmother, not human being who had once paid his tuition and bought his first car and carried him through sleepless nights. But expense. A figure on a ledger. A liability. A cost to be reduced. The air felt thinner with every passing second, and my chest began to tighten with the familiar panic of lungs deprived. I pressed my hand to the mattress, forcing myself not to thrash, not to scream, because I wanted to see if Mark would appear, if he would step in, if somewhere beneath the layers of adulthood and convenience his boyhood self still lived. The boy who once rushed to fetch me a glass of water when I coughed. The boy who used to kiss my cheek before running into school. The boy who cried when he thought I might die during pneumonia years ago. But the hallway remained empty. The stairs creaked with no one descending, and my son, my only child, remained upstairs while his wife engineered my disappearance. It is strange how quickly the body adapts to fear when it is old. The young think of panic as flailing, gasping, desperate movement. But when you are old, panic is quiet, economical, a calculation of what you can endure and what you must save for later. I lay very still, counting the seconds, rationing the shallow breaths that came without the hiss of oxygen, willing my body to endure just a little longer until they forgot me again, until the machine could be restored, until I could reach for the small backup canister I knew was hidden under the bed, but was too heavy for me to drag without giving myself away. And then, after what felt like an eternity but must have been minutes, I heard Renee's footsteps. She entered with her usual smile, carrying a folded blanket, as if her presence were an act of charity. "How are we tonight?" she asked in that syrupy tone that clung to her words like mold. Her eyes flickered to the machine, then to me, watching to see if I had noticed. I closed my eyes, feigned the drowsiness she always expected, and allowed my breathing to remain shallow, uneven, so she would believe her plan had not yet been discovered. She lingered for a moment, adjusted the corner of the blanket, and then, with the same calm she had used in the kitchen, she bent to the outlet and pressed the plug back in. The hiss returned, quiet but insistent, the sound of air forced into tubes, the sound of life returning. She smoothed her skirt, patted my arm, and whispered, "Sleep well, dear," before leaving as though nothing had happened. That night, I did not sleep. I kept my eyes fixed on the faint glow of the machine, listening to the steady pulse of air. And I thought of all the times I had been told to trust family, to believe that blood ties were unbreakable, that the child you raised would never abandon you. I thought of the nights I stayed up sewing his clothes, the years of work that went into keeping him fed, the sacrifices made in silence. And now, my life depended not on love, but on vigilance, on whether I could keep myself awake long enough to ensure the cord was not pulled again. That was the moment it became clear. I was not merely unwanted in that house. I was prey. The catalyst was not the silence of the machine alone, nor Renee's words, nor Mark's absence. The catalyst was the knowledge that from that moment forward, I could no longer deceive myself. I was not safe. I was not loved. I was not even tolerated. I was an obstacle to be cleared, a breath too many, a bill too high. That night, I decided that if I were to survive, I could not wait for their mercy. I would need to become my own witness, my own protector, my own voice, because no one else in that house would speak for me. And when dawn came, weak and pale through the narrow window of the guest room, I felt the truth settle into me with the same weight as the oxygen in my lungs. If I wanted to live, I had to leave. But first, I had to remember the secret I had kept safe for decades, folded in cloth, hidden in seams, a piece of paper that could strip them of their power. That knowledge, the existence of the will they had never seen, was no longer just a legal detail. It was my weapon. And though my body trembled with weakness, my heart beat steadier than it had in years, because for the first time since entering their home, I knew I was not powerless. The days after that first night of silence unfolded like a slow suffocation of dignity, not through open cruelty, but through the careful layering of small indignities that, taken together, began to erase the outline of who I was. Nothing was done violently, nothing screamed of abuse to the casual eye, and that was the brilliance of it, because what they practiced was not murder by sudden strike, but diminishment by accumulation. I noticed first in the meals, which grew smaller each evening, until the bowls of soup arrived half-filled, the toast cut thinner, the fruit bruised or overripe. And when I asked for a second slice of bread, Renee's lips curved into that well-trained smile as she said, "Doctor recommends light portions. You wouldn't want to upset your stomach at your age." My stomach was not the problem, her thrift was. Yet my hunger became another invisible battle, another thing I was expected to swallow along with the pills she began distributing without explanation. At first, the pills seemed familiar, a mix of my prescribed medication. But one evening, when I pretended to fumble and dropped a tablet onto the floor, I noticed it was not one of mine at all, but a different color and shape, unmarked by the pharmacy. Labels I trusted. When I asked what it was, Renee laughed softly, calling me forgetful, saying it was just a supplement for your nerves, though I had never needed such a thing. I slipped it into the pocket of my cardigan instead of swallowing, and that night I lay awake, feeling the unease coil in me tighter than any illness could. From then on, I swallowed only when I could confirm the medicine was mine, and the rest I hid away, collecting them in silence as proof of a war being waged against me under the guise of care. The first escalation came not from a single act, but from the realization that I was being rewritten in their house, turned into a caricature of frailty that justified their decisions. My call button, the small device I could press if I needed help, disappeared one morning, and when I asked where it had gone, Mark said gently, "We took it away because you keep pressing it at night. You dream, Mom. You don't know what's real anymore." His tone was careful, tender even, but his words were poison because I had never pressed that button in my sleep, and he knew it. He was erasing my credibility in front of my own eyes, reshaping me into a confused burden who could not be trusted to know the difference between dream and waking. When you strip someone of credibility, you strip them of defense, because every protest becomes an echo dismissed as confusion. The bathroom, once accessible with a walker, was suddenly declared unsafe for me. Renee appeared one afternoon with a plastic bedpan, setting it on the dresser as though it were a gift, and told me, "It's just easier this way. Less risk, less mess." She said it with a cheerfulness that turned my stomach, and though I wanted to protest, my body ached too much for the battle. I tried once to walk to the bathroom without permission, and later found the door locked, the key hidden. I was being confined, not with bars, but with inconvenience, not with guards, but with pity. Each decision she made was framed as concern, but concern that strips you of autonomy is nothing but control in prettier clothing. Mark's silence hurt more than her smiles. He rarely entered my room except to nod, to ask vaguely if I was comfortable, never long enough to notice the withering plants on the windowsill, the dust collecting near the skirting board, the way the machine hissed sometimes with irregularity. When he did speak, it was with that careful tone of someone managing a client, not a mother. "Mom, you need to rest. Don't stress yourself. Renee knows what's best." I wanted to scream that I had raised him, that no woman who arrived in his life decades later could possibly know me better than I did. But the words stuck because I knew he would not listen, and the sound of disbelief is worse than silence. I learned to watch, to wait, to collect the details of my own erasure like a detective. I saw how Renee kept the mail away from me, how bank statements disappeared quickly into her purse, how phone calls were answered in the laundry room where I could not overhear. I heard the word liquidate more than once, followed by pauses when footsteps approached. The air in that house felt staged, like every breath had to conform to their script. I was no longer the matriarch. I was a prop, useful only as long as I appeared fragile enough to justify their story. The nights grew worse. Twice I woke to find the oxygen tube slipped from my nostrils, and though my hands trembled, I reattached it myself. Once I discovered the machine unplugged again, but this time I did not panic. I simply sat in the dark, counting each shallow breath, then rose slowly, bracing myself against the dresser, and plugged it back in with deliberate calm. The air rushed in, harsh and loud, and I felt not relief, but anger. The kind of anger that steels the spine of a woman who has been quiet too long. That anger did not fade. It settled, waiting. It was in those nights that I remembered the document I had hidden years before, the folded pages of my will, written after my husband died, witnessed by my lawyer, kept in the lining of a coat I rarely wore. In that will, I had left everything not to Mark, who at the time was already showing signs of entitlement, but to my granddaughter Mia, the only one who had ever visited without being asked, the only one who spoke to me as though I were still a whole. Pursoon? That piece of paper, ink fading but still valid, was my silent rebellion, my last safeguard. And as I lay in that narrow guest bed with my lungs rasping, I knew it was the one truth they had not discovered, the one string they could not cut. The first escalation was not merely their neglect or the pills or the meals or the locked doors. It was my shift from victim to witness, my awareness that what was happening to me was not misfortune, but orchestration, not oversight, but strategy. Once you see the strategy, once you understand the pattern, the fear changes shape. It no longer paralyzes, it sharpens. And in that sharpening, something inside me stirred that had been silent for too long. I began to imagine the moment when their performance would collapse, when their careful narrative would fracture under the weight of the truth I carried in my coat. I began to imagine not my silence, but my survival. And so I waited, not passively, but with intention, storing my strength, pretending to be weaker than I was, allowing them to believe their story while I wrote another one in my head. Every smile of Renee's became a note of evidence. Every silence from Mark became a tally in the ledger of betrayal. Every withheld pill and every unplugged cord became fuel for the day I would rise, coat in hand, will in pocket, and show them that the woman they thought was fading had simply been gathering herself for the storm they would never see coming. The turning point did not arrive with trumpets or revelations, but with the quietest of gestures, a moment that in another life might have seemed ordinary, but in this one felt like the ignition of something long dormant. It was a Tuesday morning, the light filtering weakly through the blinds, painting stripes across the guest room carpet, where dust motes drifted like tiny ghosts. Renee had left early, her perfume lingering in the hallway like a warning sign, and Mark was already at work. The house was still, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the steady hiss of my oxygen machine. I had been awake most of the night, turning over in my mind the knowledge that I could not continue like this, that every day here was a negotiation with erasure, and that the will tucked away in my coat was not just a legal document, but a weapon, a symbol, the last word I still owned, in a house where every other word was twisted before it left my lips. I rose slowly, my bones aching, my hip twinging with every step. But I forced myself to move because stillness in that room had become another form of surrender. The coat hung in the closet where I had placed it on my first day here, an old woolen thing, navy blue, with a lining I had sewn myself decades earlier when fabric meant more than fashion. I reached for it, my fingers trembling not from weakness, but from anticipation, and felt inside the seam where I had hidden the folded papers. The edges were worn, the crease sharp, the ink perhaps fading. But the document was there, intact, a silent witness to everything they did not know. Holding it in my hand, I felt the strangest mixture of grief and triumph. Grief for the fact that I even needed such protection against my own child, and triumph for the knowledge that I had been wise enough to prepare for this very possibility long. Before I believed it could come to pass, as I held it, I thought of my lawyer, Mr. Hendricks, long retired now but meticulous in his craft, a man who once said to me over coffee in his office, "Always keep your documents where only you can reach them." One day you'll thank yourself." At the time, I laughed, imagining no scenario where my son would turn into the kind of man who needed protection from me. Yet here I was, whispering a thank you to a man who was probably long gone, grateful that he had spoken those words into my stubborn ears. I pressed the folded paper to my chest, as though by keeping it near my heart, I could remind myself that the power to define my ending had not been stolen. That morning, when Renee returned, I slipped the document into the pocket of my cardigan instead of returning it to its hiding place. I wanted it near me now, not just as protection, but as courage. She bustled in with grocery bags, clattering them onto the counter with exaggerated sighs, as though feeding the household were an Olympic sport performed solely for her glory. She came into my room with a forced brightness, holding up a small bottle of pills. "Doctor says these will help you sleep better. You've been restless, haven't you?" Her tone was sweet, but her eyes were sharp, searching my face for compliance. I nodded, letting her think she was winning, and took the bottle in my hand. Later, when she left, I poured the capsules into a drawer, the paper rustling in my pocket like a reminder that my compliance was a performance, not a surrender. That was the shift. The decision to act. Not yet loudly, not yet openly, but deliberately. I began to test the boundaries of their control, to remind myself that I was not yet the helpless creature they wanted me to become. When Renee left the house one afternoon, I shuffled into the kitchen and poured myself a proper cup of coffee, instead of the weak herbal tea she insisted was better for digestion. The bitterness of it filled my mouth like strength. I ate bread with butter, thickly spread, not the measured slice she allotted me, and the taste reminded me that choice, even in something so small, was a form of rebellion. I left the mug in the sink on purpose, not washed, not hidden, so that she would see it and know I was not fully under her thumb. Each act of defiance was quiet but intentional. I walked into the backyard when she said it was unsafe, just to feel the sun on my face. I wrote my name on a scrap of paper in strong, deliberate letters to prove to myself that my hand was still steady and my mind still sharp. I kept the hidden pills in a small cloth bag beneath my pillow, telling myself that if I survived this, I would place them before someone who would listen, someone who could see through the polished surface of that house. My strength was not physical. It could never be again. But strength is not always measured in muscle. Sometimes it is measured in patience, in the ability to endure quietly until the right moment comes. And then, as if the world wanted to test me, an envelope arrived, addressed to me. Renee carried it in, frowning, because she had clearly already tried to read it and failed to reseal it neatly. It was from a local clinic, a follow-up reminder about an old appointment I had missed during my hospital stay. She held it in her manicured hand, too long, before passing it to me. "It's just junk," she said quickly, but her voice betrayed a flicker of irritation that the world still recognized me independently of her. I smiled faintly, slid the letter under my pillow, and thought, yes, I am still seen. The real shift, however, came inside me, not from the coat or the pills or the coffee, but from the moment I accepted that I would no longer wait for Mark to rescue me. The boy I had raised was gone, or perhaps he had grown into someone I never fully knew, and the man who remained would not protect me because protection would require confrontation, and confrontation would threaten the fragile ease of his life. He chose silence, and his silence was an answer. That realization was both devastating and liberating. I could mourn him, but I could no longer depend on him. I had to depend on myself. That night, lying in the narrow bed, I did not stare at the ceiling in despair as I had so many nights before. Instead, I stared at the faint outline of the coat on the chair, the shape of the folded paper inside my pocket, and I felt something like resolve stirring in my chest. I whispered to myself, "Not yet. Not like this. Not on their terms." The words sounded foreign in the still air, but they belonged to me, and in speaking them, I began to reclaim the voice they had been trying to erase. From that moment on, everything changed. I was still confined, still watched, still diminished in their eyes. But inside me, a shift had taken place, small, yet irreversible. I no longer thought of myself as waiting to die in their house. I thought of myself as planning my exit, planning my exposure, planning the moment when they would see that the woman they had tried to reduce to silence was capable of speaking louder than they could ever imagine. The oxygen machine hissed beside me, steady, alive, and for the first time in weeks, I felt alive with it. The air was mine. The choice was mine. The story was still mine to write. The past never stays politely in the shadows when you try to push it there. It waits, crouched, patient, knowing that the moment you begin to imagine yourself safe, it will return with sharper teeth. And so it was in those weeks after I rediscovered the will in my coat pocket and began secretly choosing rebellion in small, deliberate gestures. For a time, I felt stronger, even in my frailty, as though the quiet knowledge of the document gave me armor invisible to Renee's sharp eyes. I drank my coffee, walked into the backyard when I pleased, ignored her patronizing coos, and let myself believe that survival was not only possible, but probable. Yet strength has a way of calling down storms, because those who live by control sense when it begins to slip. And Renee was not a woman who tolerated slippage. It began with her tone, which grew tighter, harsher, though still cloaked in that smile she wore like a uniform, a smile that said, "I am the caretaker. I am the saint. And you are the burden I bear with grace." She began monitoring me more closely, bringing my meals directly to the bed so that I had fewer chances to wander, checking the machine more often, not out of concern, but to reassert ownership, as if even the air I breathed needed her approval. Mark noticed none of this, or pretended not to. He was a shadow in his own house, slipping from room to office, from office to car, and returning late, his eyes tired, his voice clipped, his presence absent, even when his body was in the room. He would ask in that distracted way, "How are you feeling, Mom?" without ever pausing to hear the answer, and I began to understand that his silence was not weakness, but complicity. Silence is always a choice, and his choice was to protect the image of peace in his marriage rather than the life of the woman who had given him his. This truth did not break me. It clarified me. I no longer expected his rescue. I no longer wasted breath calling his name when the air went thin. Instead, I saved my breath for the moment when I would reveal that I had never been as powerless as they believed. But the escalation came not only from within the house. One afternoon, while Renee was out and Mark was at work, there was a knock at the door. I was too weak to answer quickly, but I heard Renee's friend, a neighbor whose voice I recognized, calling out, "Renee, I brought the casserole dish back." When no one responded, she stepped inside, her shoes clicking against the tile, and her eyes widened when she saw me sitting upright in the guest room doorway. "Oh," she said, startled, as though she had discovered a ghost in her friend's home. She looked me up and down with an expression that tried to be polite, but could not hide its surprise. "I didn't realize you were here." The way she said it, you would think I was an intruder. She quickly recovered, placed the dish on the counter, and left with hurried steps. But that brief encounter lingered with me because it told me something important. I was being hidden. To her circle of friends, to her community, I did not exist, or at least not as a resident of that house. I was a shadow, tucked away, my presence a secret that might complicate the image she projected of her perfect life. That realization was chilling, but it also gave me power, because what is hidden can also emerge, and exposure is the one thing people like Renee fear most. The following week, Mia called. My granddaughter's voice came faint through the landline in the kitchen, the one phone I was rarely allowed to answer. I overheard it because I was close enough to catch the sound before Renee shooed me back into the guest room. "Is Grandma there?" Mia asked, and Renee's reply was smooth, rehearsed. "She's resting, darling. She's not well enough for calls, but I'll tell her you rang." I wanted to shout, to seize the receiver, but my body betrayed me, my legs heavy, my lungs too shallow to move quickly, and by the time I reached the doorway, the conversation had ended. Later, when Renee brought me my tea, she said sweetly, "Mia called. She worries, but it's best not to upset her with how fragile you are." That was the moment I began to realize that my granddaughter was still reaching, still searching, and that connection was a rope I could climb if I timed it right. But just as hope glimmered, the darkness deepened. One night, I awoke again to silence, the machine unplugged, and this time, when I reached shakily to reattach it, I found the plug removed entirely from the wall, hidden behind the dresser. I dragged myself to the floor, bruising my knees, clawing at the heavy furniture until I could pull it back enough to reach the outlet. And when the hiss returned, the relief was not sweet, but bitter, because I knew now it was not negligence, but intention. Renee entered moments later, her hair neatly pinned, as though she had been awake, waiting for the exact moment to appear. She looked at me on the floor, the machine whirring behind me, and for the first time, her smile faltered. She said nothing. She simply closed the door and left me there, breathless, trembling, but alive. That silence, her refusal to even disguise the act with words, was more terrifying than any accusation. It was a declaration. She no longer needed to pretend. Days later, I found evidence that confirmed what I had suspected. In the trash beneath the sink, hidden under scraps of lettuce and paper towels, lay an envelope from an insurance company, my name printed neatly on the front, the contents torn open. I smoothed the pages with shaking hands, and my eyes fell on the words, "Beneficiary, Renee Harlow." She had taken out a policy in my name, a payout upon my death. And though the numbers blurred with my tears, I understood enough to know that my survival was not simply inconvenient, it was a direct obstacle to her profit. That knowledge did not frighten me as much as it ignited me, because money leaves traces, and traces leave trails, and trails can be followed to the truth. The second escalation was not only their tightening control, their bolder attempts to hasten my silence, but also the re-emergence of voices from the outside world, voices they could not completely silence. One morning, a letter arrived in handwriting I recognized instantly. Mia's. Renee intercepted it, of course, but later, when she thought I was napping, I retrieved it from the counter where she had carelessly left it under a pile of junk mail. The words inside nearly broke me. Grandma, I don't understand why you don't answer. Dad says you're too tired, but I know you would want to talk to me. Please, just let me know you're okay. I miss you. I love you. The ink was smudged as though her hand had trembled or tears had fallen, and I pressed the paper to my face, breathing in the faint smell of her perfume, and vowed that I would not let her believe I had abandoned her. That promise was fuel, stronger than oxygen. Still, the pressure built. Renee began inviting her sister over more often, a sharp-eyed woman with a voice like a whip, who looked at me with the kind of disdain reserved for spoiled fruit. I overheard them in the kitchen discussing arrangements and timelines, words that dripped with implication. I lay in bed, the will pressed under my pillow, and thought of every moment of my life when I had chosen patience, when I had chosen silence, when I had chosen sacrifice. And I knew that those instincts would kill me if I obeyed them now. This was no longer about waiting. This was about acting, about gathering the last reserves of my strength and preparing to place the truth in the hands of someone who would not look away. The climax of this escalation came one Sunday afternoon when, for the first time in months, Mark entered my room without Renee at his side. He sat in the chair by the window, his face drawn, his hands restless, and for a fleeting moment I saw my boy, the one who once clung to me after nightmares. "Mom," he said quietly, "you're making things hard." His words were not angry, but resigned, as though I were a puzzle piece that no longer fit the picture. "Renee says you fight her. You don't take your pills. You don't rest. You don't let us help you. Why can't you just trust us?" I looked at him, really looked, and felt the weight of decades collapse in my chest. "Because," I whispered, my voice rasping but steady, "trust is earned, and you gave mine away." He flinched but did not argue. He rose, left the room, and I knew then that he was lost to me. Not because he hated me, but because he had chosen convenience over conscience, and there is no return from that choice. After that, I stopped waiting. I began planning in earnest, rehearsing in my head the path to the bus stop 2 blocks away, calculating the minutes between Renee's departures and arrivals, counting the steps I could manage before my lungs gave out, deciding what to pack. The coat. With the will, the bag with the hidden pills, the letter from Mia folded inside. I traced the escape in my mind like a map, over and over, until it became muscle memory. Because the second escalation had taught me the most important lesson. They would not stop. They would not soften. They would not suddenly rediscover love. And if I stayed, I would not survive long enough to see Mia's eyes again. The morning of my departure was gray and heavy, the kind of morning when the clouds press low against the rooftops, and the air feels damp even indoors. And I remember thinking that it was fitting, that the sky itself seemed to sag with the weight of secrets about to be revealed. Renee left earlier than usual, muttering something about errands, her perfume trailing behind her, like a film I wanted to peel from the walls. Mark had already driven off, his tires hissing on wet pavement, and the house settled into that particular silence that is both terrifying and liberating. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands shaking, not from age this time, but from anticipation, and I whispered to myself, "Now." It was not a dramatic command, not a declaration of courage shouted to the world, but a quiet word spoken into the stillness, a word that meant I would no longer wait for permission to survive. I dressed slowly, carefully, pulling on the coat that had become both armor and vault, its lining concealing the folded will that was the sharpest weapon I had ever carried. In the pocket, I placed the letter from Mia, her handwriting steady but trembling with love, because I wanted her words to touch the world alongside mine. I added the small cloth bag of hidden pills, not because I intended to use them, but because they were proof of the game being played with my body, evidence of the quiet sabotage Renee had orchestrated. When I buttoned the coat, it felt heavier than it ever had, not from wool or paper, but from the weight of a lifetime, from the years of silence I was about to break. The walk to the door was longer than it should have been, each step a negotiation between pain and determination. But when I reached the handle and pressed it down, I felt something shift inside me, as though I had crossed a threshold not just of wood and hinges, but of time itself. The air outside was damp and sharp, smelling faintly of wet concrete and distant pine, and when it filled my lungs, I nearly wept because it was mine, unmonitored, unmeasured, free of her approval. I moved slowly down the walkway, gripping the railing with one hand, my breath shallow but steady, and each step toward the street felt like a reclaiming of myself, a declaration that I was more than the shadow they had tried to hide. At the corner, the bus stop stood empty, its bench slick with rain, and I lowered myself onto it with care, the tote bag at my side, the coat wrapped tightly around me. A neighbor I barely knew passed by with her dog, and she glanced at me with mild surprise before offering a nod. "Out for a bit of air?" she asked, her voice casual, unknowing. "Yes," I replied, steady. "Out for air." I almost laughed at the truth buried in the simplicity of those words. The bus arrived with a groan, its doors opening like the gates of another life, and when the driver, a young man with kind eyes, offered his arm, I took it, not out of weakness, but because even warriors lean sometimes. The hospital was where I went first, not because I was dying, but because I wanted to place myself in the hands of those who could not easily be swayed by Renee's smile. In the emergency ward, I explained haltingly, carefully, not everything but enough: the unplugged machine, the hidden pills, the pressure to be quiet, and I saw in the nurse's eyes that she believed me. Belief is a balm when you have been doubted for so long. She touched my hand and said, "You did the right thing coming here." They checked my lungs, adjusted my oxygen, gave me warm blankets, and for the first time in weeks, I felt not managed, but cared for. From the hospital bed, I made the 2 calls I had rehearsed in my mind for days. The first was to my lawyer, not the one from long ago, but a younger associate his firm had recommended when I wrote letters years earlier. His voice was brisk, professional, but when I explained who I was and what I held in my coat pocket, his tone shifted into respect. I arranged for the will to be filed officially, no longer a secret hidden in fabric, but a legal fact that would outlive me. The second call was to Mia, and when she answered, her voice cracked with disbelief. "Grandma? Is it really you?" I could barely speak for the tears in my throat, but I managed. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm safe." There was silence on the line, the kind of silence that is not emptiness, but fullness. Then her soft reply. I knew you wouldn't leave me without a word. I knew that moment was worth every bruise, every shallow breath, every night of fear. Renee arrived at the hospital later that day, her face pale under its powder, her smile stretched too tightly. She demanded explanations, spoke loudly to the staff, tried to reassert her authority with the confidence of someone who believes performance can substitute for truth. But the staff had already heard me, already seen the hidden pills I offered as evidence, already begun to document the unplugged machine I described. For the first time, her words slid off the walls without sticking. She turned to me, eyes flashing, and hissed, "Why would you do this to us?" And I, lying in that bed with the weight of survival behind me, whispered back, "Because you forgot I was listening." The climax was not shouting, not even the confrontation. In that hospital room, it was the moment I signed my name to the documents the lawyer sent over by courier, the ink flowing steady from my pen, my hand firm despite the tremor in my bones. That signature was not just on paper. It was on my own life, a declaration that I had chosen who would carry my name forward. And it was not the son who had stood silent, nor the woman who had tried to erase me, but the granddaughter who had loved me without conditions. When I set the pen down, I felt lighter, as though the decades of sacrifice had finally been balanced by a single act of defiance. That night, the hospital room was quiet, except for the soft beeping of monitors and the whisper of air flowing through the machine beside me. I lay back against the pillows, the coat folded neatly at the foot of the bed, and thought of all the times I had been told I was too weak, too old, too fragile to make choices. Yet here I was, having made the most consequential choice of all, one that no one could undo, one that would outlast even my final breath. The victory was not loud, not dramatic, but it was absolute. I had been left to die in silence, but I had walked into the world instead. I had been erased in their house, but I had written myself back into existence with ink and will. The woman they thought was finished had signed her name and claimed her life again, and that, more than air, more than medicine, was the breath I needed most. Peace does not arrive in thunderclaps or proclamations. It settles like dusk, slowly, gently, until you realize that the air you are breathing is no longer edged with fear. In the weeks after the hospital stay, after the signing of papers and the filing of documents, my life rearranged itself into something both smaller and larger at once. Smaller in that I no longer lived in a family home, no longer had the pretense of belonging under my son's roof, but larger in that I finally occupied space that was my own, a room where every corner was free of performance, where every breath was entirely mine. They moved me into a modest assisted living facility, nothing luxurious, but with windows that opened onto a courtyard where azaleas bloomed in stubborn bursts of pink. And I remember thinking that freedom sometimes looks like ordinary sunlight, falling across a table you have chosen for yourself. Mia visited often, her face bright with the relief of having found me again, and she brought small gifts that meant more than jewels could have. A framed photograph of us from years ago, me holding her as a toddler in the park, her curls wild in the wind, both of us laughing. A small potted fern that she insisted would thrive with little care, though I tended it each day as though its survival were a reflection of my own. A journal with a soft leather cover urging me to write down my stories, not for the world, she said, but for her, so she would never forget. I began to write in it slowly, awkwardly at first, but then with greater ease, filling the pages with fragments of memory, not just of betrayal and survival, but of joy, of resilience, of the countless moments of tenderness that had also built my life. In writing, I found that I was not only leaving a record for her, but also stitching myself back together, thread by thread. Mark did not visit, not once, though he called once or twice, his voice stiff, as though each word cost him pride. He did not apologize, nor did I ask him to. Some wounds cannot be mended with apologies, and some silences become too vast to cross. I let him remain in his distance, and I did not carry the weight of him anymore. For the first time, I allowed myself to love him without needing him, to remember the boy he had been without confusing him with the man he had become. That distinction was freedom, too. Renee never appeared, though I heard whispers from Mia that there were inquiries, legal complications, insurance claims denied. I did not care for the details. I had already written them out of my story. In the quiet of my new room, I began to see my survival not only as an act of defiance, but as a kind of offering, a message to women like me who are told they are too old, too frail, too near the end to matter. I thought of all the times I had nearly let their narrative become my truth, nearly accepted the role of burden, nearly surrendered to the silence. And I thought of how close I had come to being remembered only as an inconvenience rather than as a woman who had lived, loved, and fought. It is easy, I realized, to be erased when you are quiet, and it is never too late to speak, even if your voice shakes, even if it comes between one shallow breath and the next. Now, when I sit by the window and feel the air on my face, I do not think only of oxygen tanks or machines. I think of choice. I think of the way we are always given at least one more moment to choose, even when the world insists that all choices are gone. My choice was to speak, to walk, to carry that folded paper out of a house where I was being silenced and into a world where it could be heard. It was not dramatic, it was not heroic, but it was mine. And that is what matters. I do not know how many years remain to me, and that uncertainty no longer frightens me. What frightens me is the thought of another woman, somewhere, lying in a bed with her air unplugged, listening to the whispers of those who believe her life is already over. To her, if she should ever hear these words, I would say this: do not believe them. You are still here. You are still breathing. And if you can remember where you hid your truth, whether in a coat, a letter, a memory, or your own voice, take it in your hand and do not let it go. Because survival is not just about living longer. It is about refusing to let others decide how your story ends.